August 12, 1847, Magnolia Creek Plantation, deep in the Mississippi Delta. 2 infant boys were born to Colonel Richard Beaumont's wife on a sweltering summer night, one pale as moonlight, the other dark as river mud. Within 72 hours, 4 people would be dead. Within 2 weeks, 17 more would vanish without explanation. The county records from that month was sealed by order of the governor himself, and wouldn't be opened for another 93 years. What those documents revealed about superfecundation heteropaternal, a medical phenomenon where twins are born to different fathers, was nothing compared to what they concealed about the systematic murders, the conspiracy of silence, and the rebellion that nearly burned the entire Delta to ash. Before we continue with the story of Magnolia Creek and the night that changed everything, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and comment below what state you're listening from, because what happened in Mississippi in 1847 might have connections to your own hometown's buried secrets. The events that unfolded that August didn't begin with a birth. They began 7 months earlier in the cold mathematics of cruelty that defined every plantation in the antebellum South. Magnolia Creek Plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of some of the richest soil in Issaquena County. The Beaumont family had controlled that land since 1801, when Richard's grandfather purchased it from a French trading company for the price of $300 Spanish and a promise to the territorial governor. By 1847, the plantation supported 263 enslaved people, produced 18,000 bales of cotton annually, and maintained a reputation for what the local newspapers diplomatically called efficient management practices. Colonel Richard Beaumont had inherited the plantation at age 29 after his father suffered a fatal stroke while beating a field hand who'd missed quota by 15 pounds. Richard had served briefly in the Second Seminole War, earning his commission less through combat prowess than through his family's political connections to Senator Jefferson Davis. He stood 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stern handsomeness that made women at church socials look away quickly. His hair, prematurely silver at 34, gave him an air of distinguished authority that he wielded like a weapon. But it was his eyes that people remembered most. Pale grey, almost colourless, with a flatness that suggested something fundamental was missing behind them. His own overseer, a German immigrant named Klaus Hoffmann, once told his wife that looking into the colonel's eyes was like looking into a well that had no bottom and no water, just an endless drop into nothing. Colonel Beaumont had married Catherine Strafford in the spring of 1843. She came from old Charleston money, a family whose wealth derived from rice plantations and the domestic slave trade. Catherine was 22 on her wedding day, educated at a finishing school in Richmond, fluent in French, and accomplished at the pianoforte. She had honey-colored hair that she wore in elaborate braids, a slender figure that the fashion of the day accentuated with tight corseting, and a smile that never quite reached her hazel eyes. The marriage had been arranged by their families, a merger of Delta cotton and low-country rice, of political influence and social standing. Romance had nothing to do with it. Catherine moved into Magnolia Creek's grand house, a 2-story Greek Revival structure with 6 massive columns across the front and a widow's walk nobody ever used, and tried to make peace with her new life. The Mississippi Delta in 1847 was a world of contradictions that would have bewildered anyone from outside the South. Immense wealth existed alongside brutal poverty. Grand balls and poetry readings happened in houses built by enslaved craftsmen who couldn't read their own names. Churches preached about Christian mercy on Sunday mornings, then their congregants returned to plantations where human beings were worked to death by Thursday. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this system created a society that was, at its core, deeply unstable and paranoid. Issaquena County was particularly isolated, even by Delta standards. The Mississippi River dominated everything: commerce, transportation, social life, and the constant threat of floods that could destroy a year's crop in a single night. The nearest substantial town was Vicksburg, 40 miles downriver, accessible only by steamboat or a treacherous road that turned to impassable mud for months at a time. This isolation bred insularity. The dozen or so plantation families in the area socialized almost exclusively with each other, intermarried, conducted business together, and maintained a unified front on all matters related to slavery, politics, and the increasingly hostile rhetoric coming from the North. In this closed world, reputation meant everything. A whisper of scandal could destroy a family's standing. An accusation of abolitionist sympathy could lead to social exile or worse, and any threat to the racial hierarchy that undergirded the entire system was met with swift, often violent response. Catherine Beaumont understood these rules. She'd been raised in them, educated in the delicate art of maintaining appearances while ignoring ugly realities. But understanding rules and living comfortably within them were different things. Her first year at Magnolia Creek passed in a haze of supervised activities and suffocating routine. She managed the household staff, 6 enslaved women who cooked, cleaned, and maintained the house. She received visitors on Thursday afternoons. She attended church every Sunday at Deer Creek Baptist, where Reverend Amos Pritchard preached sermons that somehow justified slavery through selective biblical interpretation. She hosted dinner parties for neighboring planters and their wives, serving elaborate meals on imported china while pretending not to hear the screams that occasionally drifted up from the quarters after dark. And she tried, unsuccessfully, to produce an heir. The colonel wanted a son. He made this clear in ways both explicit and implicit. He needed a boy to continue the Beaumont name, to inherit the plantation, to maintain the family's position. When Catherine failed to conceive during the first 6 months of marriage, he grew impatient. When a year passed with no pregnancy, his impatience curdled into something colder and more dangerous. She finally became pregnant in the summer of 1844. The pregnancy was difficult. Morning sickness that lasted all day, debilitating fatigue, swelling in her legs that made walking painful. But she endured it because she believed a child would soften the colonel, would give their marriage some purpose beyond social obligation and dynastic continuation. She gave birth in March of 1845 to a girl. They named her Margaret, after the colonel's mother. The baby was small, born a month premature, with a weak cry that worried the midwife. But Catherine loved her immediately, with a fierce protectiveness she hadn't known she possessed. For 3 weeks, she barely left the nursery. She nursed Margaret herself, despite the colonel's insistence that they hire a wet nurse. She rocked her daughter through sleepless nights, sang to her, prayed over her. On April 8, 1845, Catherine woke to find Margaret cold in her cradle. The baby had died during the night. No marks, no signs of distress. The doctor who examined the tiny body said it was crib death, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence with premature infants. Catherine knew different. She'd heard the colonel enter the nursery around 2 in the morning. She'd heard the floorboards creak, heard the cradle rock slightly, heard him leave again. She'd been in that half-awake state that new mothers exist in, listening with one ear always open for their child's cry. But she'd been too exhausted to get up, assuming he was just checking on the baby. By dawn, Margaret was gone. Catherine never said anything. Not to the doctor, not to the midwife, not to anyone. What could she say? She had no proof, only a mother's instinct and the memory of footsteps in the dark. And even if she'd had proof, who would have believed her? Or cared? This was Mississippi in 1845. A man's authority over his household was absolute. If the colonel had decided his daughter was too weak to survive, too much of a disappointment to be worth feeding, that was his prerogative. But Catherine knew. And the knowledge changed something fundamental inside her. She went through the motions of grief, wore black, accepted condolences, allowed the colonel to bury Margaret in the family plot with a small marble headstone. But privately, she began to see her husband clearly for the first time. Not as a stern, but ultimately reasonable man. Not as a product of his culture and upbringing, but as something else entirely. Something broken and dangerous. She became pregnant again in late 1845. This time she was more careful. She ate in her room, took no medicines the colonel offered her, locked her door at night. But the pregnancy ended in miscarriage at 4 months. The doctor said these things happened, especially after the trauma of losing a child. Catherine suspected otherwise, but again, she had no proof. Just a lingering metallic taste in her mouth after drinking the tea the colonel had brought her the night before the cramping started. By the spring of 1847, their marriage existed only as a legal fact and social performance. They spoke when necessary. They appeared together at church and social functions. But the house had become a battlefield, even if only one of them was openly fighting. And then Catherine met Solomon Tutwiler. Solomon was not what anyone expected when they heard the word overseer's driver. The position, a slave appointed to help manage other slaves, essentially a middle tier in the plantation's brutal hierarchy, typically went to large, physically intimidating men who could enforce discipline through force. Solomon was tall, yes, nearly 6.5 feet, but lean rather than bulky, with long fingers more suited to piano keys than whips. But it was precisely his intelligence that made him valuable to Klaus Hoffman and terrifying to the enslaved people of Magnolia Creek. Solomon had been purchased at age 15 from a plantation in South Carolina, part of a lot the colonel acquired in 1838. His previous owner had noted in the bill of sale that the boy could read, a dangerous liability in South Carolina following the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion, but also that he had a talent for understanding complex systems and predicting behavior. The colonel had seen potential in this, not humanitarian potential, but economic potential. A smart slave could be more valuable than 10 strong ones, if properly controlled and directed. By 1847, Solomon Tutwiler, at 24 years old, effectively ran the day-to-day operations of Magnolia Creek's enslaved workforce. He reported to Hoffman, who reported to the colonel, but in practice Solomon made most of the decisions about work assignments, discipline, and logistics. He kept the plantation's records. Who produced what? Who missed quota? Who was sick, or pregnant, or dead? He could calculate yield predictions, optimal planting patterns, and maintenance schedules. He could also identify exactly which enslaved person was most likely to run, to rebel, or to slow down production. And he knew precisely how to prevent all three. The other slaves hated him with an intensity that went beyond the usual resentment toward drivers. Solomon wasn't just enforcing the system. He understood it, manipulated it, and used it for his own survival. He informed on escape plans before they fully formed. He identified the leaders of any potential resistance and reported them to Hoffman before they could organize. He administered punishments with a clinical efficiency that was somehow worse than rage. He also possessed something unusual for an enslaved person in 1847 Mississippi, a degree of physical freedom. Because of his value to the plantation's operations, Solomon was allowed to move between the main house, the overseer's cottage, the quarters, the fields, and even occasionally to neighboring plantations on the colonel's business. He wore better clothes than other slaves. Not fine, but serviceable and clean. He ate better food, had his own small room in the quarters, and was never whipped except once early on to establish the colonel's authority. This combination of intelligence, mobility, and perceived collaboration made Solomon the most dangerous person on Magnolia Creek Plantation, but not for the reasons anyone assumed. Catherine first became aware of Solomon in December of 1846, when she'd gone to the quarters to distribute Christmas presents, a paternalistic tradition she'd inherited from her mother-in-law. She'd brought cheap trinkets and extra food rations, playing her part in the elaborate theater of benevolent slavery. The enslaved people had lined up, thanked her with dead eyes, and accepted their gifts with practiced humility. But Solomon had looked at her differently, not with the submission she was used to, and not with the barely concealed hatred she sometimes glimpsed from others. He'd looked at her with recognition, as though he could see past the performance to the desperate, grieving woman underneath. As though he knew about Margaret, about the miscarriage, about the tea. It had lasted only a moment. Then he'd lowered his eyes, thanked her, and moved on. But that moment had cracked something open inside Catherine. She began to notice him after that. His quiet efficiency as he moved through the plantation. The way other slaves fell silent when he approached. The respect, or was it fear, in Hoffman's voice when he spoke to Solomon. The colonel's unusual reliance on this one man who, despite being property, seemed to hold genuine power. In January, she'd orchestrated their first private conversation. She'd requested that someone literate be sent to help her catalogue her late mother-in-law's library, a task that required reading titles and organizing books alphabetically. She knew Solomon was the only enslaved person at Magnolia Creek who could read. The colonel had approved the request without suspicion. He believed his wife was simply being practical. Solomon had arrived at the library on a cold Tuesday afternoon. For the first hour, they'd worked in silence. Catherine would hand him books. He would note the titles and authors in careful script, and they would place volumes in alphabetical order on the shelves. Then Catherine had asked, "Did you choose this life?" Solomon had stopped writing, carefully placed his pen down. When he'd finally looked up at her, his expression was unreadable. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand the question." Being the driver, the colonel's assistant, did you volunteer for that position or were you assigned to it? A long pause. When Solomon spoke again, his voice was very quiet, very precise. "I was assigned to it, ma'am. After they discovered I could read, the colonel decided I would be more useful in this capacity than in the fields. And you've been successful in this role." "I have kept myself alive, ma'am. I'm not certain that counts as success." The honesty in that statement, the first genuine thing anyone had said to Catherine in months, made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. She'd turned away quickly, pretending to search for a particular book. "Did you have children, ma'am?" Solomon had asked, still in that quiet voice. "Before I arrived here, I mean." "I've only been working at the main house since last year." The question should have been impertinent, crossing every line of racial and social etiquette, but something in his tone made it feel less like intrusion and more like solidarity. "A daughter," Catherine had whispered. "She died. I'm very sorry." And somehow, she knew he genuinely was. They'd continued working in silence after that, but something had shifted. An understanding had been established. Wordless but real. Over the following weeks, Catherine found reasons to require Solomon's assistance more frequently. The colonel, distracted by falling cotton prices and political tensions with Mexico, didn't notice or didn't care. Hoffman assumed it was typical plantation lady busywork, organizing closets, cataloging silver, sorting through correspondence. During these sessions, they talked. Carefully at first, then with increasing candor. Catherine learned that Solomon had been born in Charleston, that his mother had taught him to read in secret before she was sold away when he was 7, that he'd been on 5 different plantations before Magnolia Creek, that he'd survived by being smarter than his owners, by making himself indispensable, by understanding the system better than the people who created it. Solomon learned that Catherine was terrified of her husband, that she believed the colonel had murdered their daughter, that she was trapped in a life she hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. "Why don't you run?" Catherine had asked him once in March. "You're smart enough to make it north. You move freely. You could plan it properly." Solomon had smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Ma'am, smart slaves don't run. They know the statistics. For everyone who makes it to freedom, 99 are caught and tortured as examples. Running is what desperate people do. I prefer to survive." "So you've accepted this? Forever?" "I didn't say that." His eyes had met hers with sudden intensity. "I said I don't run. I didn't say I don't resist." That conversation had taken place on March 19th, 1847. The same day Catherine had discovered she was pregnant again. Catherine didn't tell Solomon about the pregnancy immediately. She didn't tell anyone, not even the colonel, for nearly 6 weeks. She'd learned caution from her previous losses, and this time she was determined to protect the life growing inside her through vigilance and secrecy. But she also knew, with growing certainty, that if this child was a son, the heir the colonel demanded, she would never have real influence over him. The boy would be raised to be exactly like his father, entitled, cruel, emotionally vacant. He would inherit Magnolia Creek and continue the cycle of brutality. And if the child was a daughter, Catherine feared she wouldn't live long enough to protect her from the colonel's cold calculations about bloodlines and utility. This fear festered through April and into May, growing alongside the child in her womb. She played her role impeccably, The dutiful wife, the gracious hostess, the quiet presence at church. But inside, she was making calculations of her own. The idea, when it first formed, seemed impossible. Insane. But it wouldn't leave her alone. She'd been reading medical texts from the Colonel's library, trying to understand what had gone wrong with her previous pregnancies. That's when she'd encountered a reference to superfecundation, the rare phenomenon where a woman could conceive twins from two different fathers if she ovulated multiple eggs and had relations with two men within a short window of time. The medical text, written by a French physician in 1823, included only 3 documented cases, all in Europe. The phenomenon was considered so rare and so scandalous that it was barely discussed in polite medical circles. But the implications consumed Catherine's thoughts for days. If she conceived twins, one from the Colonel and one from another man, there was a chance, a slim chance, that one child might be saved from her husband's influence. If one child was visibly not the Colonel's, he might reject that child entirely, might send it away or allow Catherine to raise it separately. That child, at least, wouldn't grow up to become another Richard Beaumont. It was a desperate plan, built on statistical improbabilities and wild hope. But Catherine was desperate. On May 23rd, during one of their now frequent library sessions, Catherine asked Solomon a question that changed both their lives. "If I asked you to help me destroy something," she'd said, not looking at him, ostensibly focused on dusting a set of leather-bound volumes, "would you?" Solomon had gone very still. "That would depend on what you wanted destroyed, ma'am." "A legacy. A continuation of cruelty. You're talking in riddles." Catherine had turned to face him then, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I'm pregnant, 2 months along. The baby is the Colonel's." Solomon's face had remained carefully neutral. "Congratulations, ma'am." "I don't want congratulations, I want help." She'd explained it then, haltingly at first, then with growing urgency. The theory of superfecundation, the medical texts, her desperate plan to conceive a second child from a different father, to create uncertainty, to give herself leverage and agency in a world that offered her none. "You're asking me to—" Solomon hadn't finished the sentence. "I'm asking you to help me betray my husband in a way that might save at least one child from becoming like him." The silence that followed felt eternal. Catherine could hear her own breathing, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant sounds of field workers singing as they picked cotton. "Do you understand what you're asking?" Solomon's voice was barely a whisper. "What would happen to both of us if this was discovered? I understand you'd be killed, probably tortured first. I understand I would be destroyed socially, possibly institutionalized. I understand this is the most dangerous thing either of us could do." "Then why?" "Because I watched my husband murder our daughter." The words came out sharp, certain. "Because I will not bring another child into this house without having some way, any way, to save them from him. Because I am already destroyed, Solomon. I'm just still walking around." Solomon had looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he'd asked very quietly, "Is this really about saving a child? Or is this about revenge?" Catherine had considered the question honestly. "Both." "Does it matter?" "Yes, ma'am. It matters a great deal. Revenge is a fire that consumes everything, including the person who lights it. If that's all this is, we'll both burn and accomplish nothing." "Then it's about survival," Catherine had said. "Mine and the child's. Is that acceptable?" Another long silence. Then Solomon had nodded, once, almost imperceptibly. "When?" he'd asked. "Soon. The timing has to be precise. Within the next week, possibly less." They'd made their plans carefully over the following days. Catherine tracked her body's rhythms, calculated the optimal window. Solomon identified the safest time and location. A Wednesday afternoon when the Colonel would be in Vicksburg meeting with his banker, when Hoffman would be supervising new field assignments, when the house staff would be occupied with laundry in the quarters behind the main house. On May 27, 1847, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, Catherine and Solomon met in the disused smokehouse at the edge of the plantation's main compound. The structure, built 30 years earlier, had been replaced by a larger facility closer to the kitchens and was now used only for storage of equipment nobody wanted, but nobody bothered to throw away. What happened there took less than 20 minutes. Neither spoke during it. Catherine kept her eyes closed the entire time, tears leaking from beneath her eyelids. Solomon was methodical, quick, and when it was finished, he'd helped her adjust her dress with the same careful efficiency he brought to all tasks. "I'm sorry," he'd said as she prepared to leave. Catherine had looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected, genuine anguish. "Don't be," she'd told him. "This was my choice, my plan. You were just property." He'd finished bitterly, doing what property does, following orders. "No." Catherine had touched his hand briefly, a gesture that violated every social code they'd both been raised under. "You were a person helping another person survive. That's all." She'd returned to the main house, bathed thoroughly, and resumed her normal routine as though nothing had happened. That evening the Colonel returned from Vicksburg in a foul mood. The bank had refused to extend his credit line given the instability in cotton prices. He'd eaten dinner in silence, drunk a third of a bottle of whiskey, and retired to his study without speaking to Catherine at all. She'd lain awake that night, one hand on her barely swollen belly, wondering if she'd just saved a life or condemned two. The answer wouldn't come for 4 more months. Through June and July, life at Magnolia Creek maintained its oppressive routine. The temperature climbed to brutal highs, regularly over 100 degrees, with humidity that made every breath feel like drowning. The cotton grew thick and green in the fields. The enslaved workers toiled from dawn to dusk, then beyond, as the Colonel pushed for maximum yield to compensate for falling prices. 2 people died from heat exhaustion in late June. Another attempted escape in early July and was caught, whipped, and sold downriver as an example. Catherine's pregnancy progressed normally, or as normally as any pregnancy could in that heat, in that house, in that life. She grew larger, more uncomfortable, more conscious of the ticking clock counting down to a moment that would either free her or destroy her completely. She and Solomon didn't speak privately again after that afternoon in the smokehouse. It was too dangerous, drew too much attention. But sometimes, when she saw him crossing the yard, or when he delivered reports to the Colonel's study, their eyes would meet for just a fraction of a second. In those moments, an entire conversation happened without words. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "Are you?" "Yes." "Can we survive this?" "We have no choice." The Colonel, meanwhile, grew increasingly volatile as summer progressed. Cotton prices continued falling as northern abolition agitation disrupted markets and southern paranoia increased. Political tensions with Mexico remained unresolved, and at home, his wife's pregnancy reminded him daily that he would have an heir to either be proud of or disappointed by. The uncertainty seemed to corrode something in him. He'd always been cruel in a distant, administrative way, signing off on punishments, making decisions about sales and separations, enforcing discipline through Hoffman and Solomon. But that summer, he began participating directly. He watched whippings now, counting the lashes personally. He rode through the fields during the hottest parts of the day, observing the workers with those flat grey eyes, looking for any sign of shirking. He conducted late-night inspections of the quarters, searching for contraband or evidence of forbidden gatherings. The enslaved people of Magnolia Creek responded by becoming even more careful, even more invisible. They'd learned to read the Colonel's moods, to know when he was dangerous, to adjust their behavior accordingly. But the constant surveillance created an atmosphere of suffocating fear that infected everyone on the plantation. Hoffman tried to moderate the Colonel's impulses, worried that pushing too hard would result in runaways or, worse, organized rebellion. But the Colonel ignored him increasingly. He decided that firmness, his word for brutality, was the only way to maintain order in uncertain times. Solomon navigated this deteriorating situation with his usual careful intelligence. He gave the Colonel no reason to question his loyalty. He enforced rules, reported infractions, maintained efficiency. But he also began doing something else, something subtle that only someone watching very carefully would notice. He started making mistakes, small ones, a work assignment that put the wrong person in the wrong place, a miscalculation in supplies that meant field workers ran short of water during the hottest part of the day, requiring an early break, a forgotten message that meant Hoffman rode to the wrong section of the plantation to supervise work, leaving another section unsupervised for 3 hours. Individually, these errors were minor enough to attribute to the heat, to fatigue, to the general chaos of running a large operation. But together, they created small pockets of disorder, little moments where the system's rigid controls slipped just slightly. Catherine noticed because she was watching Solomon constantly now, looking for any sign that their shared secret had changed him. And she realized gradually that he wasn't making mistakes at all. He was creating opportunities. In late July, she'd managed to speak with him briefly when he'd delivered household accounts to the colonel's study, and she'd intercepted him in the hallway. "You're planning something," she'd whispered. "I'm always planning something, Ma'am. Survival requires constant planning." "That's not what I mean." Solomon had glanced down the hallway, confirming they were alone, then met her eyes with unusual directness. "You're not the only one who wants to see something destroyed, Mrs. Beaumont. You just gave me a reason to accelerate the timeline." "What timeline?" But he'd already turned away, disappearing toward the back of the house before she could press further. The comment haunted her through the following weeks. What had Solomon been planning before she'd approached him? How long had he been preparing? And what did he mean by accelerated timeline? She got part of her answer in early August, just days before the twins would be born. Catherine had developed a habit, during the worst heat of afternoon, of sitting on the second-floor balcony that overlooked the quarters and the fields beyond. The colonel didn't object. He assumed she was simply seeking air, and pregnant women were granted certain accommodations. But Catherine wasn't seeking comfort, she was observing. From that vantage point she could see patterns. The way certain enslaved people moved between buildings, carrying items that might be tools or might be something else. The brief conversations that happened when Solomon thought no one was watching. The way, over the course of several weeks, small amounts of supplies seemed to disappear from various locations. Rope, lamp oil, kitchen knives, blankets. Individually, these thefts were minor enough that Hoffman attributed them to normal waste and pilferage. But Catherine, with nothing to do but watch and think, began to see a larger pattern. Solomon wasn't just creating small disruptions. He was stockpiling resources, preparing for something. On August 8th, 4 days before the twins would be born, something happened that brought the simmering tensions to a violent peak. A 15-year-old enslaved girl named Ruth had been working in the main house as a junior housemaid. She was quiet, competent and invisible in the way that enslaved people learned to be to survive. But the colonel had noticed her anyway. That afternoon, while Catherine was resting in her room and the house staff was occupied with dinner preparations, the colonel had called Ruth to his study. When she didn't emerge after an hour, one of the older house slaves, a woman named Bess, who'd been at Magnolia Creek for 30 years, had gone to check on her. What she found was Ruth, sobbing and bleeding, her dress torn. The colonel calmly pouring himself another whiskey, as though nothing had happened. Bess had helped Ruth to the kitchen, cleaned her up, and told her to say nothing to anyone. It was the same advice she'd given other girls over the years. Speaking up only made things worse. Silence was survival. But Solomon had been in the kitchen getting water for Hoffman when they'd arrived. He'd seen Ruth's condition, seen the blank horror in her eyes, understood immediately what had happened. And something that had been carefully contained inside him for 24 years suddenly cracked open. That evening, Solomon requested a meeting with Hoffman. He reported, in his usual precise manner, that Ruth was injured and wouldn't be able to work for several days. He suggested she be given light duties until she recovered. He showed no emotion, offered no opinion, simply relayed information. But Hoffman, who'd worked with Solomon for 9 years, heard something different in his voice. A flatness that was even flatter than usual. An absence that suggested the presence of something being forcefully suppressed. "Are you all right?" Hoffman had asked, surprising both of them with the question. "Yes, sir. Just tired from the heat." "Solomon, if there's something—" "There's nothing, sir," Will that be all?" Hoffman had let him go, but he'd sat alone in his cottage afterward, deeply uneasy. He'd always known Solomon was dangerous in the way that very intelligent people trapped in impossible situations are dangerous. But he'd thought that danger was fully contained, fully controlled. For the first time, he wondered if he'd been wrong. Catherine learned about Ruth the next morning from Bess, who told her in the careful, coded language enslaved people used when discussing their owners' crimes. Catherine had felt something cold and final settle in her chest. This was who her husband was. This was what she was protecting her unborn children from. That evening, she'd written a letter to her brother in Charleston, something she'd never done before. As the colonel read all her correspondence, she'd hidden the letter in her sewing basket, unsure if she'd ever be able to send it, but needing to create some record, some evidence, some connection to a world outside Magnolia Creek. The letter read, in part, "Dear Thomas, I am writing to inform you that if anything should happen to me during childbirth, you must know that it was not God's will or natural misfortune. I have reason to believe my husband is not a safe person. I cannot explain further in writing, but please know that if I die, it will not have been accidental. Please look after my children if there are any. Please do not let Richard raise them alone. Your loving sister, Catherine." She'd sealed the letter and hidden it between the pages of her Bible, a book she knew the colonel would never touch. 3 days later, on the night of August 11th, Catherine went into labor. The contractions started just after sunset, a familiar tightening across her belly that she'd felt twice before. Catherine was in the music room, pretending to read, when the first real pain seized her. She'd gasped, gripping the arm of her chair, and the book had fallen from her hands. Bess, who'd been dusting nearby, had immediately understood. "I'll fetch the midwife, ma'am, and tell the colonel." "No." Catherine's voice was sharp. "Not yet, not the colonel, just the midwife. Tell him I'm feeling poorly and retired early. Don't tell him about the labor until it's further along." Bess had looked at her strangely. Most women wanted their husbands informed immediately, but she'd nodded and hurried out. The midwife, an older enslaved woman named Dinah, who delivered half the babies born at Magnolia Creek over the past 2 decades, arrived within 20 minutes. She'd examined Catherine quickly, efficiently, then settled into a chair by the bed. "First baby usually takes a while," she'd said calmly. "But you've done this before, ma'am. Your body knows what to do." But Catherine had done this before, and both previous pregnancies had ended in death. She couldn't shake the feeling that this labor would be different, not just because of the superfecundation, but because of everything else. The violence simmering beneath Magnolia Creek's surface. The plans she'd set in motion, the secrets she'd buried that were about to be violently exhumed. The hours crept past, the contractions grew stronger, closer together. Catherine paced when she could, gripped the bedpost when she couldn't, tried to breathe through the waves of pain. Dinah remained calm, experienced, occasionally checking her progress. Around midnight, Bess finally informed the colonel. He'd been in his study, working through accounts, and he'd received the news with his typical flat affect. "How much longer?" he'd asked. "Hard to say, sir. Could be hours yet. First babies take their time." The colonel had nodded once, poured himself another whiskey, and returned to his paperwork. He didn't go upstairs to check on his wife. He didn't send encouragement or reassurance. He simply waited, as one might wait for a crop report or a business transaction to conclude. But while the main house focused on Catherine's labor, something else was happening in the quarters. Solomon had been making his rounds as usual, checking that everyone was in their assigned cabins for the night, that no fires burned that shouldn't, that order was maintained. But his route took him past every cabin, and at each one he'd paused for just a moment. To the casual observer, he was simply being thorough, but he was actually delivering a message, repeated in whispers at each door. "Tonight, be ready. When you hear the bell." There was no bell at Magnolia Creek. The plantation used a horn to signal work times, but everyone who received the message understood what Solomon meant anyway. The bell was a metaphor, a signal, a beginning. By 2 in the morning, Catherine's labor had intensified to the point where she could no longer contain her screams. The sounds carried through the house, through the open windows across the yard. Women in the quarters who'd given birth themselves winced in sympathy. Men who'd heard those sounds before, accompanying births, deaths, whippings, tried not to listen. Hoffman, sleeping fitfully in his cottage, heard the screams and felt uneasy for reasons he couldn't articulate. Something felt wrong beyond the normal wrongness of a difficult birth. The air itself seemed charged, oppressive, like the minutes before a lightning strike. At 3:15 in the morning, Dinah checked Catherine's progress and announced that it was time to push. Catherine, exhausted and terrified and in more pain than she'd ever experienced, bore down with everything she had. The first baby came quickly after that. A boy, small but healthy, crying lustily as Dinah cleared his airways and wrapped him in clean linen. Catherine, sweating and trembling, reached for her son with desperate hands. "A boy, ma'am," Dinah said, smiling. "Strong lungs on this one. The colonel will be pleased." But before Catherine could hold him, another contraction seized her, stronger than any before. She cried out, confused. The baby was born. Why was she still in so much pain? Dinah's eyes widened. "Ma'am, there's another one. You're carrying twins." The next 10 minutes were a blur of pain and pressure and animal effort. Catherine pushed until she thought she might die from it, until the world narrowed to nothing but her body's overwhelming imperative to expel this second life. The second baby came at 3:47 in the morning. Another boy, slightly larger than the first, also crying, also apparently healthy. But when Dinah wiped the blood and fluid from the second infant and saw his skin, darker than his brother's, unmistakably darker, her hands froze. Catherine saw the midwife's expression and felt her heart stop. "Let me see him." Dinah hesitated, then placed the second baby in Catherine's arms. In the lamplight, the difference was subtle but undeniable. The first twin had pale skin like his father, fine blonde hair, grey eyes. The second twin had darker skin, not black, but coffee-coloured, caramel, dark hair, and eyes that were already showing hints of brown. For a moment, no one spoke. Catherine held both babies, one in each arm, looking from one tiny face to the other. The super-fecundation had worked. She'd conceived twins from 2 different fathers. The medical impossibility had become medical reality, and now everyone would know. "Ma'am," Dinah whispered, her voice shaking, "what have you done?" Before Catherine could answer, the door to her bedroom opened. The colonel stood in the doorway, still fully dressed, whiskey glass in hand. He'd come to see his heir. His eyes went to Catherine first, then to the babies she held. For a long moment, his face showed no emotion at all, that terrible flatness that Catherine had learned to fear more than rage. Then he stepped into the room, set his whiskey glass on the dresser with exaggerated care, and approached the bed. "2 sons," Catherine said, her voice barely audible. "Twins." The colonel looked at the first baby, touched his pale cheek with one finger. Then he looked at the second baby, and something happened to his face. Not anger exactly. Something colder. A calculation occurring behind those flat grey eyes. "Whose is he?" The colonel's voice was very quiet. "Yours." "They're both—" "Don't." The word was sharp as a blade. "Don't insult me, Catherine. I may be many things, but I'm not blind." He leaned closer, examining the second twin with the same detachment he'd used to examine a suspicious cotton boll. "Whose is he?" Catherine's mind raced. She'd prepared for this moment, had rehearsed various responses, but now that it was here, all her planned words evaporated. "There's a medical condition called superfecundation. I know what superfecundation is." The colonel straightened, picked up his whiskey glass, drained it. "I'm not an uneducated man, Catherine. I know it's possible in theory for twins to have different fathers, but it requires specific conditions. It requires you to have lain with 2 men within a very short time frame." He paused. "So I'll ask you again, whose is he?" The silence stretched. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 4 times. "Solomon," Catherine finally whispered. "Solomon Tutwiler." She'd expected violence, A blow, screaming, immediate rage. But the colonel simply nodded, as though she'd confirmed something he'd already known. "Your driver," Dinah breathed, backing toward the door. "Lord have mercy, Mom, you laid with Solomon." "Get out," the colonel said without looking at the midwife. "Tell no one what you saw here. No one. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Dinah fled, leaving Catherine alone with her husband and the babies. The colonel walked to the window, looked out at the pre-dawn darkness. When he spoke again, his voice had that administrative quality Catherine recognized from business discussions. "Here's what's going to happen. You will stay in this room until I decide what to do with you. The babies will be taken to a wet nurse. No one beyond those already present tonight will see the second child. And Solomon," he paused, "Solomon will be dealt with appropriately." "Please," Catherine said, clutching both infants tighter, "please don't hurt him. This was my idea, my plan. He was just property following orders." The colonel turned from the window, and for the first time, Catherine saw genuine emotion in his eyes. Not anger, not hurt, something worse, satisfaction. "Yes, I imagine that's exactly how you rationalized it, how he rationalized it. But you see, Catherine, it doesn't matter whose idea it was. A slave who touches a white woman hangs. That's the law. That's civilization. That's order. Then hang me too. I'm equally guilty." The colonel actually smiled. "Oh, my dear, you're far more useful to me alive. Institutionalized, perhaps. Sent away to one of those asylums for women whose minds have been weakened by childbirth. That's what people will believe, of course, that the strain of bearing twins drove you to madness, to delusions about adultery. No one will believe you actually lay with a slave willingly. They'll assume you're simply insane." The calculated cruelty of it took Catherine's breath away. He was going to use her confession as proof of madness, would lock her away, would control the entire narrative. And Solomon would die for a crime that she'd initiated. "You can't," she whispered. "I can. I will. And Catherine." He moved closer to the bed, looked down at both babies with clinical interest. "I'll keep the white one. Raise him as my heir, as though nothing irregular occurred. But the other—" He reached out as if to touch the darker twin, then withdrew his hand. "The other is an abomination. A stain on my family's name. I'll have him taken to the quarters, sold downriver as soon as possible. He'll disappear into the cotton fields of some plantation where no one knows his origins, and he'll die there, forgotten." "No." Catherine pulled both babies against her chest. "You can't separate them. They're brothers. They're innocent." "They're a white child and a mulatto bastard," the colonel corrected. "And I'll do with both whatever serves my interests best. Now give them to me." He reached for the babies, and Catherine, exhausted, bleeding, traumatized but still a mother, did something she'd never done before. She fought back. She kicked at him, scratched at his hands, screamed for help loud enough to wake the entire house. The babies, jostled and frightened, began crying in earnest, their wails mixing with Catherine's screams and the colonel's shouted commands. Bess burst into the room, saw the struggle, froze in horror. Behind her, Hoffman appeared, drawn by the noise, his face pale in the lamplight. "Sir, what's happening?" "Hold her down," the colonel ordered. "Take the babies, now." But before anyone could move, a sound cut through the chaos, a sound that didn't belong in this moment, in this house, in this world. The deep, resonant toll of a bell. Everyone froze. Magnolia Creek didn't have a bell. The plantation had never had a bell. The toll came again, then again. Steady, rhythmic, impossible. Hoffman moved to the window, looked out toward the quarters, and what he saw drained all color from his face. "Sir," he whispered. "Sir, you need to see this." The colonel, still holding one of Catherine's wrists, turned toward the window. What he saw there made him release his wife and move toward the glass, his expression transforming from controlled fury to something approaching shock. The quarters were on fire. Not one cabin, not an accident. Every single structure in the slave quarters was burning simultaneously, flames climbing into the pre-dawn sky, smoke billowing in great black columns. And in front of the fires, silhouetted against the orange glow. Dozens of figures stood in absolute silence, watching the main house. Dear God, Hoffman breathed. They're just standing there. They're not running, they're not panicking, they're just watching. The bell tolled again, and now they could see its source. Someone had mounted the plantation's large iron cookpot on a wooden frame and was striking it with a metal bar, creating deep, resonant tones that carried across the entire plantation. "It's a signal," the colonel said, his voice flat again. "They've organized. This is rebellion." As if to confirm his words, the silent watchers began to move. Not toward the main house, not in a panicked mob, but in organized groups, spreading out across the plantation with clear purpose. Some headed toward the equipment barns, others toward the cotton stores. Still others began advancing toward the main house itself. "We need to barricade the doors," Hoffman said, backing away from the window. "Get the weapons. Sir, we need to— Where's Solomon?" The colonel's question cut through Hoffman's panic. "Where is Solomon Tutwiler?" As if in answer, a figure emerged from the smoke and flames, walking slowly up the path from the quarters toward the main house. Even from a distance, even through the haze, they recognized him. Solomon, tall and unhurried, carrying something in his hands. The colonel watched him approach with that calculating expression. He planned this. All of it, the fire, the organization. This is what he's been preparing for. "We need to leave," Hoffman insisted. "Sir, we can't defend against this many." "No." The colonel's voice was ice. "We're not leaving. This is my property, my land, my slaves, and I will not be driven from it by—" His words were cut off by the sound of breaking glass downstairs. Voices, footsteps. The rebellion had reached the house. Catherine, still in bed, still holding both babies, felt a strange calm settle over her. This was it. The moment everything converged. Her betrayal, Solomon's long-laid plans, the colonel's cruelty, the system's violence, all of it reaching critical mass simultaneously. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Magnolia Creek intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The colonel grabbed Hoffman's arm. "Get downstairs, protect the weapons cabinet. I'll be right behind you." After Hoffman left, the colonel turned back to Catherine. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment they both understood that everything they'd built, the marriage, the plantation, the carefully maintained facades, was collapsing. "This is your fault," he said quietly. "Your betrayal started this." "No," Catherine replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Your cruelty started this, years ago, with Margaret, with Ruth, with every person you've brutalized. I just gave Solomon a reason to act on a plan he'd been making for years. You created this. I just accelerated it." The colonel stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. Catherine heard him lock it from the outside, trapping her in the bedroom with her newborn sons. She was still sitting there, both babies in her arms, when she heard the first gunshot from downstairs. The next hour unfolded like a nightmare rendered in fire and blood and the breaking of things that had been held rigid for too long. Hoffman had reached the weapons cabinet, a locked cherrywood case in the colonel's study containing 2 rifles, 3 pistols, ammunition, and the leather-bound ledgers that documented every enslaved person ever owned by the Beaumont family. He'd armed himself and taken position at the study door, prepared to defend the house. But the enslaved people of Magnolia Creek didn't attack the house directly. They did something more strategic, more devastating. They locked all the doors from the outside and set fire to the first floor. Solomon had planned this carefully, had studied the house's layout during his months of access, had identified the weak points and the death traps. The main house, like most plantation homes in the Delta, was built almost entirely of wood, cypress beams, pine floors, oak paneling. It would burn fast once the fire really took hold. The flames started in the kitchen, where Solomon's people dumped lamp oil across the floor and walls before igniting it. The fire spread to the dining room, the parlor, the colonel's study. Smoke began filling the lower floor almost immediately, thick and black and choking. Hoffman, realizing too late that he'd trapped himself, tried to shoot his way through the locked study door. The first shot splintered the wood but didn't break the lock. The second shot did, but by then the hallway beyond was already engulfed in flames. He staggered back into the study, coughing, eyes streaming, and made his way to the window. He got it open, prepared to jump to the ground 15 feet below, and found Solomon waiting there. "Don't," Solomon said simply. He held a pistol, one Hoffman recognized as having come from the plantation's own stores, stolen weeks ago in one of those small attributed to pilferage thefts. "You can jump and die quickly, or you can burn and die slowly. But either way, you're dying tonight, Klaus." Hoffman, German immigrant, man who'd survived poverty and cholera and the brutal passage to America, who'd thought himself practical and realistic about the system he participated in, stared at the man he'd worked beside for 9 years. "I treated you fairly," he said, and actually believed it. Solomon's expression didn't change. "You treated me like I was intelligent property instead of stupid property. That's not fairness, Klaus. That's just a different kind of exploitation. So this is justice? Murder? No," Solomon said quietly. "This is survival. You just happen to be in the way." The smoke drove Hoffman back from the window. Through the haze, he saw Solomon turn and walk away, leaving him to his choice of deaths. Hoffman chose the fire. It seemed faster than the fall, and died in the colonel's study, surrounded by account books that documented the buying and selling of human beings as though they were livestock. The colonel himself had moved more intelligently. When the smoke began filling the first floor, he'd immediately gone upstairs to the second level, which was slower to burn. He'd broken the lock on Catherine's door, his own lock, his own cage for her, and entered to find her still sitting in bed, calm as death, both babies quiet in her arms. "We need to leave," he said. "Now." "How?" Catherine asked. "You locked the doors. Your own people set this fire. Where exactly are we supposed to go?" The colonel moved to the window, evaluated the drop to the ground. Too far with an injured wife and 2 infants. He looked toward the widow's walk, the decorative balcony on the roof that no one ever used. If they could get up there, they could potentially climb down the main columns. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I don't know. Probably not far. Then I'll carry you. And the babies." Catherine laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Now you want to save us? Both babies? Even the one you called an abomination?" "They're my property," the colonel said flatly. "All 3 of you. I don't surrender property to slaves. Now move." But Catherine didn't move. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, and made a decision. "No." The colonel turned from the window, shock registering on his face. "What did you say?" "I said no. I'm not going with you. I'm not letting you take these babies and raise them in your image or sell them or destroy them. I'm done, Richard. I've been dead inside this house for years. The only difference now is that the house is burning too. You're hysterical. The childbirth, the trauma. I'm clear-headed for the first time in my life." Catherine stood shakily, both babies secure in her arms. "I'm going to walk out of this house, and I'm going to find Solomon, and I'm going to trust him with my sons' lives more than I've ever trusted you." The colonel's face transformed then, the flat affect finally cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "You'd trust a slave over your own husband? You'd condemn your sons to lives as what? Free, unknown, away from you?" Catherine moved toward the door, each step agonizing but determined. "Yes, absolutely yes." The colonel blocked her path. "You're not leaving. Then we'll burn together. At least we'll be warm." For a moment, they stood frozen in tableau, husband and wife, owner and property, 2 people who'd destroyed each other through calculated cruelties and desperate rebellions. The smoke was creeping up the stairs now, visible through the open door. The heat was becoming unbearable. The house groaned around them, timber beginning to fail. Then the colonel did something Catherine had never seen him do before. He stepped aside. "Go," he said quietly. "Take them. But know this, Catherine, if you survive this night, if you escape with my property, I will spend the rest of my life hunting you. I will use every resource, every connection, every legal mechanism to find you and bring you back. You will never be free of me." "Yes, I will," Catherine said, "because you're going to die in this house tonight. You can't know that. I can." She moved past him toward the door, leaving a trail of blood on the floor. She'd torn stitches standing, but she didn't care. "Because you'll never leave. You'll die trying to save your ledgers, your documents, your proof of ownership. That's who you are, Richard. That's all you are, and it's going to kill you." She didn't look back to see if she was right. She simply walked through the door, down the smoke-filled hallway, toward the stairs that led to the first floor, and the flames and whatever waited beyond. The Colonel stood alone in the bedroom for almost a minute, Catherine's words echoing in his mind. Then, as she'd predicted, he turned and ran, not toward escape, but toward his study, toward the weapons cabinet, toward the ledgers that documented his wealth and status and identity. Hoffman's body was already cooling when the Colonel reached the study. The fire had consumed most of the first floor by now, but the metal weapons cabinet had protected its contents. The Colonel wrapped his coat around his hand, opened the hot metal door, and began pulling out ledgers. The ceiling collapsed on him before he could save even half of them. He died instantly, crushed beneath burning beams, surrounded by the documents that had meant more to him than his wife, his children, or his own humanity. Catherine, meanwhile, had made it down the stairs through a combination of adrenaline, maternal desperation, and sheer bloody-minded determination. The first floor was an inferno, but there was a narrow path through the flames where a door had been knocked off its hinges, creating a draft that kept the fire momentarily at bay. She stumbled through it, both babies screaming now from heat and smoke, and emerged into the pre-dawn air. She collapsed immediately, unable to take another step, both arms locked around her sons, and found Solomon kneeling beside her. "I didn't think you'd make it out," he said quietly. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the babies, both of them, with an expression she couldn't read. "Are you going to kill me?" Catherine asked. The question seemed reasonable, given the circumstances. "No," Solomon said. "I'm going to help you escape, but we need to move quickly. The other planters will have seen the fire by now. People will be coming." He helped her stand, supported her weight as they moved away from the burning house toward the tree line. Behind them, Magnolia Creek's main house collapsed inward with a sound like God-breaking kindling, sending sparks spiraling into the lightening sky. They'd made it perhaps 50 yards when Catherine's legs gave out completely. She sat heavily on the ground, still clutching both babies, leaving a trail of blood behind her. "I can't," she gasped. "I'm sorry, I can't go any further." Solomon looked back toward the plantation, calculating. Then he made a decision. "Give me one," he said. "What?" "Give me one of the babies. I'll take him north to freedom. You take the other, go to your family in Charleston. If we split up, if we separate the twins, there's a better chance that at least one survives. If we stay together, we all die when they catch us." Catherine looked down at the two tiny faces in her arms. The pale one, the dark one, the Colonel's son and Solomon's son. Brothers who would never know each other if she agreed to this. "Which one?" she whispered. "That's your choice. I'll take whichever one you give me." The impossible decision. The choice no mother should have to make. But Catherine understood the logic, understood that Solomon was offering the only real chance either child had at survival. Slowly, carefully, she handed him the darker twin. Solomon's biological son, the child whose existence had started this entire catastrophe. "His name is Thomas," she said, "after my brother. Promise me you'll remember that. Promise me he'll know he was named for someone. I promise." Solomon took the baby with surprising gentleness, cradled him against his chest. "What about the other one?" Catherine looked down at the pale baby in her arms, the Colonel's heir, the child who was supposed to continue the Beaumont legacy. "James," she said. "I'll call him James." Solomon nodded once, then turned and melted into the forest without another word. Catherine never saw him again. She sat there for another minute, alone with James, listening to the sounds of Magnolia Creek destroying itself. The fire, the screams, the chaos. Then she forced herself to stand one more time and began walking south, toward the river, toward Charleston, toward some impossible future. She made it approximately 2 miles before a search party from the neighboring plantation found her. By then she'd passed out from blood loss, but James was still alive, still crying, still demanding his mother's attention with the insistent voice of all newborns. The official story, as recorded in county documents and newspaper accounts from August 1847, went like this. Magnolia Creek Plantation experienced a catastrophic fire of suspicious origin on the night of August 11th. Colonel Richard Beaumont perished attempting to save valuable documents from the flames. His wife, Catherine Beaumont, survived along with one infant son, James Beaumont, born that same evening. Approximately 263 enslaved people took advantage of the chaos to attempt escape. Most were recaptured within the week and sold downriver to plantations in Louisiana and Texas. The ringleaders were never definitively identified, though several suspects were hanged as examples. Mrs. Catherine Beaumont, traumatized by the events and weakened by childbirth, was committed to the care of her family in Charleston and later transferred to a private sanitarium for treatment of nervous exhaustion and hysteria. That was the official story. But like most official stories in the antebellum South, it was built on convenient lies and strategic omissions. The truth was messier, darker, and far more complicated. Catherine did return to Charleston, but not as a broken woman requiring institutionalization. Her brother Thomas, upon reading the letter she'd hidden in her Bible, a letter miraculously recovered from the ruins by a house slave who'd saved it deliberately, understood exactly what had happened at Magnolia Creek. He used his family's connections to ensure that Catherine was placed in a sanitarium that was actually a discreet boarding house for women escaping impossible situations. She lived there quietly under an assumed name for 2 years, raising James away from public scrutiny. The baby thrived. He grew into a healthy, intelligent child who knew nothing of his father's cruelty or his mother's desperate choices. Catherine told him when he was old enough to ask that his father had died heroically trying to save others from a fire. It was close enough to a truth to salve her conscience. In 1849, Catherine remarried a modest merchant from Savannah who asked few questions about her past and treated James as his own son. They had 3 more children together, and Catherine lived to see them all reach adulthood. She never spoke publicly about Magnolia Creek, and the few times someone recognized her name and asked about the tragedy, she would smile politely and say it was all so long ago and so painful that she preferred not to dwell on it. But privately, in journals she kept hidden until her death in 1891, Catherine wrote extensively about that night. About Solomon. About the choice she'd made to separate her sons. About the guilt that haunted her every day, not for betraying the colonel, but for not being brave enough to keep both babies, to somehow save them both. She wrote, "I tell myself I did the only thing possible, that splitting them up gave each boy a chance at life they wouldn't have had together. But I dream of Thomas, the son I gave away, and wonder who he became. Whether Solomon kept his promise, whether my baby lived to see freedom or died in some cotton field, nameless and forgotten. James will inherit money and status. But Thomas, if he survived, inherited something potentially more valuable, the possibility of actual freedom. I hope it was worth it. I hope I didn't simply condemn him to a different kind of death." As for Solomon and Thomas, their story becomes harder to trace. In the chaos of the Magnolia Creek fire, approximately 47 enslaved people successfully escaped and were never recaptured. This was an unusually high number, suggesting that Solomon's planning and organization had been far more extensive than anyone realized. There are fragmentary records, carefully vague, deliberately incomplete, that suggest a tall black man traveling with an infant made it to Cincinnati, Ohio, by late 1847. From there, the trail goes cold, which in the context of the Underground Railroad often meant successful passage into Canada. In 1852, a man named Solomon Turner, note the slight name change, appeared in the records of Chatham, Ontario, a settlement known for accepting fugitive slaves. He worked as a carpenter, was described as literate and intelligent, and lived alone except for a young boy he claimed was his son. The boy, approximately 5 years old, was named Thomas and had notably light skin for being the son of a man as dark as Solomon Turner. This could be coincidence. Chatham was full of fugitive slaves rebuilding their lives under new names, many with complex family situations resulting from the fractures of slavery. But the details align too precisely to ignore. The name, the timing, the child's appearance, Solomon's documented literacy. If this was indeed the same Solomon from Magnolia Creek, he kept his promise. He raised Thomas in freedom, in a country where the boy's mixed heritage was unusual but not illegal, not shameful, not dangerous. Thomas Turner grew up learning carpentry from his father, learning to read and write, learning that he was valuable not as property but as a human being. Thomas Turner, again, if he was indeed the same Thomas born on that violent August night, married in 1867 to a woman named Elizabeth Grant, daughter of freed slaves who'd settled in Chatham in the 1830s. They had 4 children. Thomas worked as a school teacher and community organizer, advocating for the rights of black Canadians and supporting fugitive slaves arriving from the States. He died in 1904, at age 57, surrounded by grandchildren who knew nothing of Mississippi or Magnolia Creek or the night their grandfather's existence had sparked a rebellion. His obituary in the Chatham Planet described him as a pillar of the community, a devoted educator, and a man who lived with quiet dignity and purpose. There was no mention of his origins, no reference to the circumstances of his birth. Just the simple facts of a life lived in freedom. Meanwhile, back in Mississippi, the Magnolia Creek fire became a cautionary tale whispered between planters over whiskey and cards. The story mutated in the telling, becoming less about human decisions and more about the inherent danger of slaves, the constant threat of rebellion, the necessity of harsh discipline to maintain order. The fact that the rebellion had been sparked by a white woman's choice to sleep with an enslaved man was largely erased from the narrative. Too shameful, too threatening to the racial hierarchy that undergirded everything. The land that had been Magnolia Creek Plantation sat empty for 3 years before being purchased by a speculator from Natchez. He cleared the ruins, rebuilt more modestly, and operated it as a cotton farm with a much smaller enslaved workforce. But the plantation never regained its former prominence, and locals claimed the land was unlucky. Crops failed regularly. Buildings suffered inexplicable damage. Workers reported feeling uneasy in the fields where the old quarters had stood. The property changed hands 7 times between 1850 and 1900, each owner staying only a few years before selling at a loss. The pattern suggested less supernatural curse and more practical reality. The land's reputation made it difficult to hire overseers or purchase slaves willing to work there. Memory, even half-true memory, has power. During the Civil War, Union forces burned what remained of the main house during their Vicksburg campaign, and after that, the Magnolia Creek property was subdivided and sold off in pieces. By the early 20th century, nothing remained to mark where the plantation had stood, except some foundation stones and a handful of grave markers in what had been the family cemetery. One of those markers read, Margaret Beaumont, March 8th, April 8th, 1845. Gone too soon. The colonel's first daughter, whose death had been the beginning of everything that followed. Catherine had made sure before she left Mississippi that Margaret's grave was properly marked. It was the only acknowledgement of the child who'd lived just 3 weeks, but whose death had cracked open her mother's carefully constructed denial about who her husband truly was. The historical record contains one final curious document discovered in a trunk of papers donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives in 1967 by a descendant of Thomas Strafford, Catherine's brother. It's a letter dated September 3rd, 1890, written in an elderly woman's shaking hand. The letter is unsigned, but the handwriting matches Catherine's journals. It's addressed simply, "To Thomas, if you still live." The letter reads, "I am an old woman now, with death approaching more quickly than I'd like. My son James is 53 years old, a successful attorney in Atlanta, a father himself to children who never knew their grandfather's cruelty. I have lived a good life, much longer than I deserved given my choices and their consequences. But I write this not to confess or seek absolution. I write because I want someone to know the truth about the night you were born. The official histories will record only fire and rebellion and a mad woman's delusions. They will not record that 2 boys were born, brothers, one black and one white, separated by fear and necessity and an impossible choice. They will not record that your father, Solomon Tutwiler, was the bravest and most intelligent man I ever met, and that whatever happened between us that afternoon in May was less betrayal and more mutual survival. They will not record that he planned a rebellion so precisely that 47 people found freedom because of it, or that he risked everything to help a white woman escape her prison even after she'd used him for her own desperate purposes. They will not record that I think of you every day, that I wonder who you became, whether you're alive or dead, free or enslaved, happy or broken, that I carry the guilt of splitting you from your brother like a stone in my chest, knowing it was necessary but hating that it was necessary. If you live, if somehow this letter finds you, know that you were wanted, that you were named for someone who mattered to me, that your birth, however complicated and violent, was not shameful but defiant, that you were loved even in the moment I had to let you go. I hope Solomon kept his promise. I hope you found freedom. I hope you never learned the hatred I saw consume so many, though you had every reason to embrace it. Your mother, Catherine." The letter was never sent. Catherine died in Charleston on November 3, 1891, at age 70, having never found a way to deliver those words to the son she'd given away. The letter remained in her personal effects, eventually passed down through James's family line, a mystery that none of her descendants could fully understand or explain. The official records of Issaquah County contain only the barest facts about Magnolia Creek, the fire, the deaths, the property transfers. They don't mention twins. They don't mention Solomon Tutwiler by name. He appears only as ringleader, identity unknown, presumed escaped. They certainly don't mention Catherine's choice, or the medical phenomenon that made it all possible, or the 15-year-old girl whose assault had been the final spark. But absence of documentation doesn't mean absence of truth. It just means that some truths were too dangerous to record, too shameful to acknowledge, too threatening to the social order that men like Colonel Beaumont had built their entire world upon. In the years following the Magnolia Creek fire, similar incidents increased across the Deep South. Small rebellions, mysterious fires, unexplained disappearances of enslaved people in larger numbers than usual. The system that relied on absolute control was discovering that absolute control was impossible to maintain indefinitely. Every crack created opportunities, and desperate people became very good at finding opportunities. The Civil War would come 14 years after that August night, and with it, the legal end of the institution that had created the conditions for tragedies like Magnolia Creek. But the war wouldn't erase what had happened, wouldn't undo the separations, wouldn't heal the wounds that ran so deep they'd marked entire generations. James Beaumont grew up believing his father had been a stern but honorable man who died trying to save others. He became an attorney as his mother had hoped, and used his position to quietly help freed slaves navigate the legal system during Reconstruction. He never knew he had a twin brother, never knew his mother had made an impossible choice in fire and blood, never knew that his very existence was tied to an act of desperate rebellion that had cost dozens of lives. He died in 1902, successful and respected, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried the Beaumont name into the 20th century, completely ignorant of the violence and tragedy that had marked their origins. As for Thomas and Solomon, their trail goes cold after Mississippi. Whether they made it north, Whether they found the freedom Solomon had been planning for, whether Thomas grew up knowing his true story, or lived his entire life believing a gentler lie, these questions have no definitive answers. The absence of records could mean death, or it could mean successful escape into a life where documentation was deliberately avoided, where the past was intentionally obscured, where survival meant becoming invisible to the very systems that had once claimed ownership. Perhaps that's the most fitting end for their story. Uncertainty. The same uncertainty that Catherine lived with every day for 44 years. The same uncertainty that haunted her enough to write that letter in her final year, knowing she'd never send it, needing to write it anyway. What is certain is this. On August 12, 1847, in a small corner of Mississippi, the systems of power and control that seemed absolute proved to be fragile. A woman made a choice that destroyed her marriage and her social position, but possibly saved her children. A man who'd been treated as property for 24 years proved he was capable of organizing a rebellion sophisticated enough that nearly 50 people found freedom. And 2 babies were born, whose very existence challenged every assumption the society around them was built upon. The fire that consumed Magnolia Creek that night burned for 3 days, visible for miles in every direction. Neighboring planters watched the smoke rise and understood that what had happened there could happen anywhere. That fear, legitimate, well-founded fear, changed how they treated their enslaved people, at least temporarily. More food, fewer whippings. A loosening of the absolute control, just slightly, just enough to relieve some pressure. It didn't last. Within a year, most plantations had returned to their previous practices, the lesson of Magnolia Creek forgotten or willfully ignored. But for a brief moment, something had shifted. Power had revealed itself to be conditional, not absolute. And that revelation, once seen, couldn't be completely unseen. The land where Magnolia Creek Plantation once stood changed hands many times over the following decades, each owner staying only briefly before selling at a loss. Locals avoided it, claiming the soil was cursed, that crops grew poorly there, that animals refused to graze in certain fields. More likely, the land simply carried too much memory, too much pain soaked into the soil, too many ghosts. Not supernatural ones, but the weight of history, of violence, of choices made and lives destroyed. Some places hold on to their past like that, refusing to let it go, insisting that those who come after acknowledge what happened there. By 1900, most of the Magnolia Creek property had been divided into small farms worked by sharecroppers, many of them formerly enslaved people or their children, working land their ancestors had been forced to work under very different circumstances. The old main house was completely gone, reclaimed by kudzu and time. The quarters were gone. Even the cemetery had been largely abandoned, the gravestones weathered and leaning, most of the names illegible. Only Margaret's marker remained clear, protected by its marble construction and perhaps by Catherine's determination that her daughter not be completely forgotten. Gone too soon, it read. And in a way that could have been the epitaph for everyone who'd been touched by the events of August 1847. Everyone had been taken too soon, in one way or another, by death, by separation, by choices they shouldn't have had to make. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying horrors in history weren't supernatural. They were the systems human beings created and maintained, the casual cruelties they justified, the impossible choices they forced on each other. The real horror of Magnolia Creek wasn't in ghosts or curses, but in the documented, legal, socially accepted practices that made a night like August 11th, 1847, inevitable. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Catherine made the right choice separating her sons? Could there have been another way, or was this the only path to survival? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who appreciates the dark corners of American history. These stories need to be told, need to be remembered, need to be understood, not to judge the people who lived them, but to ensure we never create conditions where such choices become necessary again. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video.